everyone, I'm Zanae Dames, the Marketing and Events Manager at Digital. I'm pleased to welcome you to our second webinar for the year, Navigating the AI Terrain, Key Considerations for Establishing Strong Policy and Governance Frameworks to Manage Your Risk Exposure. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada we live, work and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral land of Indigenous people. As myself and much of the digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with our audiences in the coming week. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address it at the end of the Q&A portion. That's it from me, and I'll be handing it over to Jen, our Director of Intellectual Property, to get this webinar started. Thanks so much, Jen.
Thanks so much, Zanae, and bonjour everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful that we have attendees joining in from across the country for this month's webinar as we continue exploring all things AI. Whether you're a new or a returning participant to Digital's IP series, we're thrilled that you could join us for this Thought Leadership Power Hour. Next slide, please. Establishing comprehensive policies for AI usage is essential for safeguarding organizational reputation, mitigating risks, and maximizing the benefits of AI technologies responsibly and sustainably. And as AI technologies continue to integrate into various aspects of business operations, it's incumbent on organizations to take a critical look at existing policies and governance practices and overlay them with an AI lens. Evolving this framework serves several crucial purposes in ensuring compliance with legal and regulatory frameworks governing AI use, addressing concerns related to data privacy, security, and ethical considerations, mitigating risks associated with AI implementation, including algorithmic bias and discrimination, and promoting transparency and accountability for the board and management teams. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll walk through policies and practices organizations should consider adopting, evaluating, and quantifying the risks associated with AI practices whilst maximizing business opportunities, and strategies for aligning frameworks related to the responsible use of AI, with a Q&A portion to close us out. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation, setting the framework for projects that address cross-industry challenges while creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers. Please join me in welcoming Anthony De Fazekas and Meredith Leary. Meredith is a partner in the Boston office of Mintz and experienced with data use and governance. Her practice is focused on disputes, licensing, outsourcing transactions, and strategy, particularly related to AI. Her extensive litigation and arbitration experience provide a unique and valuable perspective in identifying and mitigating risk and in the front end of developing critical business relationships. With a passion for championing the advancement of women in the legal profession, she is also chair of the Mintz Women's Initiative and collaborates extensively in creating and driving initiatives that support sponsorship, mentorship, advancement, and retention of women attorneys. Anthony is a partner in the Toronto office of Mintz and a go-to intellectual property attorney and strategist who advises IP-centric and data-rich companies across a range of industries and has worked with public and private companies of all sizes, venture capital investors, and research institutions. He has a particular focus on information technology, including AI and fintech, as well as innovations at the intersection of computing technologies and healthcare. Anthony currently teaches courses on IP commercialization at Osgoode Hall Law School and is a frequent speaker on IP and tech innovation topics in various areas. And with that, Meredith and Anthony, I hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jen. That's fantastic. Thanks for the introduction. And it's a pleasure for us to be here and have a conversation about managing AI risks. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what Meredith and I wanted to share is our current thinking at Mintz, largely based on our cooperation with our clients. As you can imagine, AI is top of mind for many, many companies, whether they're consuming AI clients as well. As you can imagine, with our practice, both in Canada and the US, we're exposed to a lot of companies where we're really co-creating risk management approaches. And so we want to translate these best practices to you. Much of the presentation today is really going to a certain extent focus on what mid-sized companies would adopt. So the approaches that we're going to present to you, they scale up with size and sort of risk, if you will, because the larger the organization and depending on their business, even regardless of size, they're going to face sort of expensive risk, if you will, related to the use of AI, but it also can scale down. And we're happy at the end to give you some takeaways. For example, if you're a startup, what does this mean for you where you don't necessarily have a formal board, for example? But really the focus of this presentation is on all the risk-related issues that companies who are using or selling AI should be thinking about. And we're putting that very much within the context of corporate governance. So I know a lot of companies are interested in, we need a policy for dealing with AI risk. What does that look like? But regardless of the size of the organization, we feel quite strongly the conversation has to start about corporate governance and then the various policies that make sense within the corporate governance conversation around AI risk. We'll slot it and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. Over to you, Meredith.
Absolutely. So we're really happy to be here and to talk about these things. We know that they are scary and a bit overwhelming. And so our hope today is to really give everyone sort of a level setting view of this sort of compliant approach and sort of to demystify a little bit of what folks are talking about when we're talking about where to go and where to get started. And so maybe if I just kick to where sort of leading companies are thinking about AI governance now, and it's really a classic risk versus reward balance. And what we're hearing from our clients and from really leading companies in this area is that there's more and more focus on the risk in not adopting AI and not doing so in a timely fashion for competitive purposes as compared to their competitors versus the risks associated with AI. And the reality is that the risks regulatorily and otherwise is uncertain and it's evolving. And there's a lot more investigation and a lot of people that want to regulate and have a say about this who haven't actually made decisions yet about exactly what the rules of the road are, which is always a really difficult environment to operate in. And our one message to you is it's time to move forward now. No company should let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, because this is changing and it's changing quickly. But the fact that it's changing quickly and that the regulatory landscape is uncertain does not mean that we don't have some vision into what good and responsible AI use looks like, how we should approach it, and sort of you have to start somewhere and then start revisiting rather than start nowhere and waiting for something to sort of land in any certain fashion. And what this really involves is being a little bit of a predictor based on principles rather than prescription. So what does it look like? What do we know about AI and its risks? How is AI different from other risks? And in light of that, what would our defense be when we were going to say, we did this because, and it was reasonable because? And if you have that lens for thinking about your AI policy you're really a good starting point toward getting to where you sort of need to be based on what's likely and knowing that it may change over time. So it's not something where you want to set it into stone and forget about it. It's something that, organizations are going to have to really continue to review and revisit. And so what we're really seeing also is sort of what are your existing governance policies? And we appreciate that some might be, preliminary or general, depending on the size of your organization, or for large organizations, they could be, very sophisticated. And so the question is, how are we calibrating what we have or building something, if we don't have it, that really deals with AI and its complexities, which really relates to sort of the cross-functional use and how many elements of business and risk that AI touches. And then how do you implement it? So to have a policy that can't be operationalized is, really not valuable to anybody. So how is it that you're defining, what AI use in your organization looks like, what AI risk in your organization looks like, and then how is it that you are implementing those at least on day one, knowing you're going to have to revisit it on day two. Next slide.
Yeah, so is AI risk really different? And I think we can make the argument that AI from a risk point of view, it's not the first time that we've had risk that companies care about that's technology related. And in relation to a technology where we're not necessarily sure where it's going to go. I mean, AI has some special technological aspects that make the risks in the future harder to predict, but organizations have had to deal with increasing data intensification. They've had to deal with cyber risk before. They've had to deal with a financial crisis before. So it's not without precedent that companies have to start developing some policies and procedures around horizon scanning around risk and mapping and mitigating those risks regularly because the risk landscape is changing. So AI is very much like that. But there's some interesting interdependencies, I would say, when it comes to AI technology. And the first one really is the dependency on data. And we've already seen, Meredith more than me, that data governance is a big gap in companies in any case. And so part of the risk relates to making sure that the data governance strategy is AI ready. So that's a big thing. And of course, the nature of the technology is such that, it's maybe that the normal approach to dealing with emerging risks within the company isn't really sufficient. So it's not so much that there is necessarily lack of preparedness around AI within some companies in particular. It's more that there isn't a risk mitigation culture that exists yet. And what we're starting to see with clients is that they are starting to upskill in this area where they will receive business benefits outside of AI, partially because of the fear around adoption of AI technology. The other part that I think makes AI a little bit different is that many companies are used to working with certain vendors versus large companies, perhaps, technology vendors, especially if you yourself are a larger company. And now, in wanting to adopt AI technology, the reality is there are a lot of new vendors and they're relatively untested. And so I think the supply chain inherently has a bit more risk around AI technology. And of course, we know that AI by its nature can be unruly. There could be unexpected negative outcomes, for example, around ethical bias, let's say. Extensive use of open source and open data is a big thing too. Not that AI is the only reason why companies should have their house in order when it comes to some kind of decision trees or rules around adoption of open source software or open data. But because of the prevalence of these particular sources of data or computer code in AI, we're finding that the sort of the speed of adoption of open source software in particular is being accelerated by AI. So companies have to kind of grapple with that risk as well. And more importantly, I'd say that the impacts and the legal risks are going to be cross-functional and interdisciplinary in this area. And that in and of itself makes AI potentially different. So depending on the industry, and partially because the technology is going to touch many other parts of the business as it's deployed, there has to be an interdisciplinary approach to both mapping and managing those risks. And lastly, well, we are even finding on our team, because we've assembled a team that is dealing with AI risk advisory services to our client. We have an extensive team that builds in the human rights expertise, the privacy expertise, the intellectual property expertise, the contracts expertise, and so on. But even with all of our resources, we find that there are areas where we need to reach outside, and especially on international human rights, which is the area that a lot of experts feel is the specific area of the law and of general expertise even that is going to be relied upon in developing the legal and ethical frameworks for managing the risk around AI. So really, from the point of view of compliance, international human rights is going to be an important body of law, if you will, to guide how companies navigate AI risk. And that's an area of, it's a very niche area of expertise.
I just want to weigh in on one thing before we move on to the next, and that is just to underscore sort of when we're talking about it being cross-functional and interdisciplinary, like why that's so important. And it's because we all want to analogize to what is this like. So in our organization, regardless of the size, we want to say, where does this live? Where does responsibility for this live? Where does decisions around this come from? And I think what's really unique about AI, both in terms of its promise and its challenge, is that it really is something where it doesn't fit neatly necessarily into any of your existing areas of responsibility. And so you really have to create that cross-disciplinary interfunctional group to say, okay, we are consuming AI. Are we producing AI? What are the people who are interacting with AI doing it? How are they doing it? Is it how they're doing it today, what we thought they were going to do when we said that they could do it? Are we saying no all the time and then knowing people are ignoring us? Like, how is it that you're saying, here are all of the different risks, IP risks, confidentiality risks, privacy risks, and saying, okay, how do we have the right people at the table making the right decisions at the right time? And I think that's really, the talisman of why AI risk is both challenging and exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And part of our suggestion is that in order to navigate the AI terrain, a good place to start is to have a conversation around corporate governance and really extending well-established principles related to corporate governance to deal with AI risk. There isn't necessarily a lot that's available in terms of thought leadership around the link between corporate governance and AI at the moment. So we've spent some time thinking about this and figuring out where the best resources exist. We're going to send a version of our slides around, which Digital will send around to all of you, including some of these resources. But there have been various parts of the legal community and the financial community that have been developing certain guardrails around how do companies, big or small, get smarter around risk management generally. And the best thought leadership really came out of the last financial crisis, kind of post 2008 and 2009 and 10. And some interesting frameworks and models were suggested where you could pretty easily make incremental changes to your corporate governance to create more of a risk mitigation culture. And that really applies very nicely to managing AI risk. So how do you get the organization ready to predict risk more accurately in an uncertain climate? And then once you're aware of those risks, how do you make tweaks within your corporate governance model, within your corporate governance structure to address those risks on an ongoing basis? And so here on this slide, we just decided to pop up a definition of what principles of corporate governance might be from the OECD. And you can see it's really about how the companies run. So we've got the board, we've got the management, we've got their respective roles, and how do they all work together? And how do you build resilience to change and resilience to risk within those structures? That's really what corporate governance is about. And that's the type of conversation we're suggesting that everybody should be having, whether you're consuming or selling AI. Next slide, please.
So I guess
Yeah, sorry, please, you go. Sorry.
Sure, absolutely. So this slide is really about the why. And what's really interesting about AI is it's absolutely critical that AI be addressed at the board level and that the tone at the top and the strategy at the top be set at the top. At the same time, we know a lot of the risks relating to AI are the risks that are seen and happen at the bottom on the ground. And so how is it that you get that bottom-up feedback with top-down direction? And I think the only way you can do that is to go about it with intention. Having the board really assess and set the tone for what are the risks, what risks are tolerable, and how is it that we are going to both set the tone and then make sure that the information flow is upstreaming to the board so that the board can then weigh in and give direction for management to implement downstream. And so we know, board fundamentally have fiduciary duties. And we know that when things go wrong, if things go majorly wrong, the place that regulators and others are going to look is, well, what did the board know? What did they do about this? How did they go about knowing that this was a significant and emerging risk in the marketplace? What was their plan? And why didn't their plan work? And so I guess the very first thing there is you need to have a plan. And so having no plan is, the worst position to be in. And so when the board sets that plan, I think it really does fit within the, traditional governance model. What would a reasonably responsible board member who's exercising her due care in this situation do, given this emerging risk that everybody's talking about? As importantly, what is the company's strategy? And how can a company not be left behind when everybody is accelerating their businesses and scaling with AI, particularly when doing so really involves a lot of third-party risk both from your contractual counterparties, your vendors, your internal risk, but then also who are those counterparties and vendors contracting with? Where are they getting this technology? What is feeding the technology? Because AI really is the technology itself, the people that interact with it, and then the data that feeds it. And how is the board really thinking about those three things and making an assessment to make sure that all those three things are being considered? Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, and I think you have to have that conversation first before you even know what policies you're going to need as an organization, right? So, and then the other part of that also is if you jump to let's draft some policies without that robust conversation within corporate governance, and Meredith is referring to, then you're going to end up with policies on a shelf somewhere. And when there have been lawsuits around this, whatever lawsuits they might be, and that's the answer, the board said, oh, well, we think there was a policy somewhere, but there wasn't that robust discussion around risk and mitigating that risk. It's not really going to help the company. And I think the other point here is that there are different stakeholders that are reviewing this. It's not just the regulators, let's say, it's also investors, and that's really critical here. So if you are an AI company, even if you're relatively early stage, your investors are going to be looking at what your corporate governance conversation around this is, or how are you planning for it in the future? Maybe you haven't constituted your board yet, but you have a plan around that, and you even have a plan of attack on how you're going to initiate these types of conversations. That's something an investor will want to see. Are you thinking about stakeholders more broadly than just your shareholders? What obligations do you owe society at large? All of that has to be built into the stage appropriate conversation around corporate governance and AI risk.
So I think on this one, sort of leading off on what, building on what Anthony said, where do you start? And I think the very important start is to look at what you have and also what you don't have. So even with experienced boards, you may have gaps in expertise that are pertinent. Again, because AI involves both technology and the use of technology and the data that feeds the technology, this is not something that every board, much less the international human rights component that Anthony mentioned, that every board is going to have on its board. And so if they don't have somebody who really has the facility to talk about these issues and to lead, what is the knowledge that they're missing? What is the expertise that would, help them come up with an AI risk strategy and source it, because that expertise is out there. And the first step is to sort of identify what gaps that there may be. And then second is really talking about risk. Now, lawyers love talking about risks. And the reason is because we are brought up and bred to identify them. But the real key here with AI is not to be the no police. Because if the answer is AI is scary and the answer is no, then you have a policy that will fail. Because it's not possible anymore to conduct any business that doesn't involve data and AI. And at the end of the day, AI is data. That's what AI is. It's how the models are built and how the data is utilized to accomplish a function that would otherwise have to be accomplished on a much smaller scale. And so when we think about risks, there are generalized risks, confidentiality, there are privacy risks, personal information risks, IP risks, protecting what you're building risks. But what are the risks for your organization? Because just being in the mindset of there are a lot of risks here and we are the no police really isn't A, actionable, or B, realistic. Because then you'll have a situation where you know your business and your company is not complying with your mandate because it's just not practical. So instead, having a strategy session to say, okay, given where our business is, both in terms of stage of development, both in terms of what we're doing, what's our product, what is our output, how are we using this? Are we using this in ways that we know are inherently sensitive or at risk? What are the things that the AI could do, and what result could AI lead to that we wouldn't tolerate if a human did it? What are those things? And then once you sort of have a holistic view of just not only the general risks, but the specific risks of your business, identify, what your strategic objectives are. Where is, at the end of developing these policy and guidelines, where do we want to end up strategically? What's most important to us? What is our outcome going to be? And then really go through a process of what are our risks? How are we staging the risks or categorizing them? If everything is identified as a high risk, then nothing will be seen as high risk. That's just life. That's the no police. And that just will never work. And so when we're saying, okay, what can we go through pretty quickly to say this is de facto yes, because we just don't think this is a big risk to us. What's de facto no? The risk associated with this use or deployment of AI or this technology, insert here, that risk is such that we are never going to get comfortable with it in this iteration. Maybe as the technology evolves, we'll become more comfortable with it. And then, is there anything in the middle? And how are we going to deal with that? And then once you have those risks, how is it that you're both operationalizing, controlling for those risks, and then really building in who are the decision makers, where are the controls, and then where are the controls reevaluated over time? Because again, this technology is changing so quickly. Where we have controls in place, and say, for example, there is technology that you're comfortable with or a use case that you're comfortable with, and then other people in your business find out about this technology, or they said, okay, we thought we were going to use it for A, but turns out now the technology does Y, or I didn't know it could do Y, or yesterday it couldn't do Y and now it can. And so that's what I call, use case scope creep. So we thought we were comfortable with it and now we're not. If we don't have a register of the risk and we don't have a set of understanding about what it is we're comfortable with and why, then as that use case changes, it's hard for us to know whether or not we have to reevaluate that risk and come up with new parameters. And that's sort of the last point is, once you unfurl or unroll something, it'd be nice to sort of put it away and not have to think about it again. That's generally a bad idea when it comes to policies, but it is particularly a bad idea here because the requirements, the technology, and the expectations are evolving so quickly that it's something where, there have to be a strategy for how are we going to revisit this? When are we going to revisit this? And when we do revisit it, who are the appropriate stakeholders and voices to have at the table? And that can lead us to make a decision that is workable for our organization, but also realistic.
That's great. Yeah, so I think on this slide, Meredith and I, we just wanted to kind of share like how this normally goes, right? So I think having that strategy session, digging into within that session, the risk tolerances and everything that Meredith said is going to be an important conversation. Then usually what happens is out of that conversation, there's a decision around what's going to be most appropriate for this company, this organization. How are they going to achieve AI governance, which is sort of this idea of managing AI risk through corporate governance. And what we gathered here is sort of what we usually see. So when we're asked to go in and help, let's say, a company sort of mid-size and up, this is what generally tends to happen. So first, there is going to be a risk assessment, very similar to what Meredith was speaking to on the last slide, but of course, tracking. But it doesn't have to necessarily include all of the steps of the previous slide. As we said earlier, you could scale it up, scale it down. You kind of determine what's the appropriate scope of the risk assessment and what are really the outputs that you're looking through. And we'll have some examples in a subsequent slide, but this is where you might make decisions around, okay, these are the policies that we really need. Our risk assessment tells us that this is how we're working around AI, these are the risks, and so we need to create some process for risk mitigation, let's say with a policy. And so through that, you develop, it could be a rather comprehensive or pretty basic risk mitigation strategy, but there are often some specific elements to that. Now, depending on the organization, they may decide, for example, we are using actually AI both internally, we're using AI with external parties. We've got quite a number of use cases already that we're working on. Some of them we're thinking about rolling out commercially. And we need help creating almost like a streamlined decision tree or set of resources to make sure that we don't end up with the no police that Meredith was talking about earlier, because we're going to have a much more rapid and responsive approach to compliance more generally if we develop a framework. And then the organization may realize, okay, there's a legal part to this because we are concerned about legal compliance. It could be because we're in a regulated industry or not. Legal compliance will mean very different things depending on the circumstances. But there's also an ethics piece that really the legal compliance doesn't fully answer, because we're concerned about our public reputation. We want to be a responsible corporation or other organization. And so we view, from a corporate governance point of view, the role of the company as one that owes obligations to stakeholders other than shareholders. And so it's not just about responsible AI, it's about being a responsible organization. And so we need that ethical framework built as well. And so we've been working with clients to create or co-create those types of things. And then often related to that, we realize, okay, we're looking at risk from the perspective of adoption of AI, let's say, within the company. Maybe it's just part of our digital transformation strategy more broadly, but we see that there are other related things that we maybe need to tweak, and data governance might be one of those. And then we decide, okay, we need certain corporate policies, and then the training education piece is really important, because we may realize as part of our policy that in order to mitigate risks effectively, we have to change certain corporate functions that don't really relate to the board or the C-suite. A good example of that is internal audit. So we may realize, okay, in a larger organization, we are playing a role of managing risk with our internal audit team, but they need some training related to AI risk specifically, and here's how we make that happen. Or it could be board training as well. And then the last thing that I would just mention is just sometimes we do see that there's a bit of a update around IP strategy, because a lot of times a company goes through this process, and it may be that the board, perhaps for the first time, this has happened many times, they realize the extent of the planned use of AI within the company. And that can be something that's very exciting. But the board is also often seized with making sure that the company has a very robust approach to IP governance, because in many organizations, especially this is an innovative company we're talking about, 90 to 95% of the value may reside in intangible assets. And so they may realize, well, we're using this AI, some of these projects are resulting in assets that the company should own and control, whether it's data assets or AI tools, whatever it may be. We need to tweak our IP strategy to make sure that we're capturing that value so that we can monetize it. So oftentimes there's a bit of a refinement or readjustment of the IP strategy because of that. And so before I hand it over to Meredith, I just wanted to quickly reference a tool that many of you may be familiar with. Radical Ventures, a VC based in Toronto that invests primarily in AI, and an organization that we're privileged to work with. They recently open sourced a set of tools that they call RAISE, or Responsible AI for Startups. And particularly for the early stage companies who are attending today, I really want to urge you to look at those resources. It was designed based on how Radical approaches investing in AI startups. So in a way, they've opened up what they do to plan for their investment committee meeting. What kinds of things do they ask the company about, the AI company about, in terms of how they're approaching the risks around AI, how are they thinking about responsible AI, and then they create a risk assessment through that lens of the investment committee, and they've shared how they think about it. So I think for startups, this is really the first sort of open source or publicly available view into how VCs are thinking about investing in AI tech that I've seen. And it's quite interesting. And I think it really represents, for startups at least, a good benchmark of how they should be thinking about these issues. Because it may not be that you need this corporate governance review yet. It may not be that you need a ton of formal policies yet, but you do need to answer the types of questions that investors will have, and this is a good window into that. Over to you, Meredith.
Absolutely. And so sort of building on that, one of the things that when we think about AI as lawyers and pragmatists is, well, how do you go about doing this? Like, how are you thinking about this? And I think this is an area where not being a technologist actually has some advantage in that could you explain this to somebody who does not understand advanced algorithms? And if the answer is you can't, you're probably not in a good position to defend it. And so when I say that, I think, we've got this first bullet here is sort of a ethics and design. So how does the technology itself work? When the people who are building the technology, whether you're building it yourself or you're procuring it, how does the technology itself work? And what known risks associated with AI or any sort of machine learning, how are those mitigated? And a lot of that, again, comes back to the data. Anthony and I are obsessed with data. That's one of the many things we have in common. But it really is data governance, knowing where data came from, knowing how you came to it, knowing what rights there were to it, and knowing its sort of reliability or its inherent bias is just absolutely critical, because without knowing what goes into the machine and then knowing how the machine works, and then knowing how you're using what comes out of it, you can't really answer how it is that your use of AI was legal and ethical. And legal and ethical concerns are not the same, but they are related in that how is it that we are building this so that we know the bias or the risks of AI are not completely avoided, because that's not possible, but that they're mitigated or addressed. At which point is a human, and they, always talking about human in the loop in the context of AI. And it's not just a human in the loop in terms of relying on the output. It's a human in the loop in the design. At each point in the design, like how are we building in those pragmatic ethics concepts or privacy concepts, or, we have here explainable AI, like how would we have done this without the computer? And now that we're using the computer and this data, how might it be different? And those could be really beneficial reasons, because humans are notoriously slow when it comes to comparisons with computers. But we also know that when you're using computers, particularly around things that are predictive by nature, not conclusive, how is it that we are building in, practically speaking, hardwiring these core values? And similarly, the last 2 points on this slide was, when you're designing, when you're assessing, when you're testing, and you're using standards and accountability mechanisms, again, how is it that you're taking the AI risk lens when you're building the technology, not just when you're worrying about or going to use the output of the technology?
So when you take all those principles and you go through the conversations that Meredith and I have been describing in the session, how does that then translate? Like, what are the deliverables? What are the key things that the average company will absolutely need to do? And this is where we gather some examples. I mean, not every company is going to need everything on this slide necessarily, but most who are scale-ups and up do. That's sort of our experience these days. They may have some of these in play, and then they need to sort of fill some gaps. But generally speaking, this is almost like a sort of like a check mark you have to kind of have to make sure that you have all these things in place. So usually what will happen is that the company does the corporate governance review with the AI risks in mind, and then they realize, well, wait a minute, maybe we should create ownership around some of these risks and make it explicit and have a policy around that. That's extremely common. Usually it sort of ends up in most company structures with the audit committee, because the audit committee generally in most organizations, and this can differ obviously, but they will be seized with risk management. And so they will want some training in this area. They will want some specific policies on how do they engage in this conversation on a recurring basis. What does that look like? Almost adding some points to their default agenda, for example. And then if the company has an internal audit function, this is where we're seeing companies do a lot of work, where they want to upskill the internal audit function to deal with these risks so that they're updating the risk register that we talked about in an earlier slide, for example. Because the audit committee doesn't have the time to deal with this constantly, but they want to receive regular reports, often from the internal audit folks. In many organizations, they're starting to talk about what does AI readiness mean for them. May depend on the nature of the AI, so different if it's generative AI, for example, than other forms of AI technology. And then they want to tie metrics to that so they can actually evaluate if the company is becoming more or less ready depending on changes out in industry, essentially. And then a fair amount of bespoke design around reports and reviews. That's what we're seeing almost every company, as described, engaging in.
Absolutely. And then sort of related to that, and again, I'm back to my very favorite topic on data governance. And the reason is because data governance is hard. It's hard even for very sophisticated companies and even data reliant companies. And so people not knowing where their own data is, how they got it, is it reliable, can I use it? If there are restrictions around how I can use it, where do those restrictions come from? Are they contractual restrictions? Are they restrictions imposed by ethics? Are they restrictions imposed by government expectations, by regulations, et cetera? And so I think thinking through, one of the great opportunities of AI is to really think about data governance as a business priority, because you're going to have, in order to both maximize your own data, protect your data from being maximized by somebody else in a manner that's not what you expect, you need to understand the etiology of your data and what your data governance practices are, and how data is entering your organization, how it's being tracked within your organization, how it's exiting, and really having policies around that, and policies that are realistic in terms of where you already are. And so I'll say I work with lots of very sophisticated companies, and they all struggle with data governance, because the bigger they are, the more data they have, the longer they've had that data, and the way that that data was organized, tracked, used for over time has muddied a little bit in a lot of instances, sort of who owns that data? Whose data is it? When does it become my data? What's a fair use of that data? And so I really think an updated data governance policy has to go hand in hand with AI, even if it's not specifically relating to AI technology use or development, because those two concepts go hand in hand. And what we've seen in the explosion in AI, we're also seeing around data use more generally outside of machine learning models. And then I guess lastly, I missed our last page, was sort of like, let's talk about the policies themselves. And so again, Anthony and I have sort of previewed, policies are absolutely critical, but policies that aren't followed are the worst kind of liability you have. So I'll tell you, in my 20-something years of doing litigation, the very first thing I'd love to find is, here is the policy and here's how you didn't follow it. And I'll tell you why I love that as a litigator, because it tells me you knew. You knew what you were supposed to do and you didn't do it. And you knew people weren't following it and you weren't tracking it. So I think when you think about your policies, it has to be actionable, it has to be followable, and it has to be updated. So I don't want to scare you by saying, okay, that means I should have no policies, because the only thing worse than having a policy you don't follow is having no policy at all, because that's really the ostrich approach, and that never works. But I think when we think about our policies, it really relates to what we were talking about earlier. Like, how are you classifying risks? What's the why to my what? What's the why to my what? And if you have what without a why, then you're really in trouble, Because A, you're not going to get adoption by your internal stakeholders. B, you're not going to know how to revisit it, how to update it when things change. And so when we think about classifying risks, it's really important, again, my favorite to know police, to say, we think these things are high risk and we're not touching it. We think things are low risk, either from a use case or a technology perspective. You are permitted to do this without further review. Do not stop, go, and let us know. And then, tracking what you're doing and what you're using, because that's the other thing that's really hard for organizations, is to really say, okay, we have approved, or we are comfortable with these things, or we are using these things, or we've greenlit these projects. And then over time, as things change, keeping a current list of the what and the why will really help you then modify, update, and upscale that as the time comes. Next one I'm just going to hit on that's really important is around procurement. And so in most organizations that I work with and that I'm familiar with, the relationship of procurement with legal and compliance functions is kind of it can really be different in the organization, but really procurement is so often thought about as like driving price, managing vendors in the general sense and in the sort of general risk sense. And I think that one of the areas where AI really is different than any other or most any other risk that we regularly encounter is the third-party risk, because there's such lack of visibility into what your vendors are doing, what your vendors' vendors are doing. Because if you take all of the data governance, all of the things that you don't even know about your own organization, and then you multiply them times 10, because you're having pass-through towards many organizations, and then you've got a procurement function or policy that's not asking the right questions or elevating the right answers. I don't know if folks were following it all. There was a recent decision that came out from the FTC here in the States about use of facial recognition technology in Rite Aid stores. And that's just really a great example of, when procurement, and this is if anyone hasn't taken a look at that complaint, I really recommend you do so, because it's frightening. It's frightening in all of the sort of what should I have done? How should I have known to do that? But a lot of the things that the FTC points to really is this third-party risk. What does this technology you bought do? How do you know that it worked properly, and who is making those decisions? And I think when we think about procuring that, really elevating this concept of when we're doing diligence in AI and we're buying technology, it's not about just price in your ordinary procurement functions. It really is, what questions are we asking? What answers are we getting? And then what follow-up are we doing to make sure that those answers actually check out with what we're seeing in practice? Really critical.
Thank you, Meredith and Anthony. As we kind of wait for a couple of questions to come in, I think I just wanted to tease out a little bit, kind of talking about sort of, the larger sort of governance side and, things around, how things may impact an IP strategy, et cetera. But is there something that we can kind of drill down to a little bit, in informing all of these things as an organization, regardless of size, sector, to speak to their employees or their contractors, et cetera, just sort of as that baseline of, how they should be sort of approaching these things? Are there some sort of best practices, before even sort of those policies are communicated to build sort of that culture around that and that discussion around, organizations related to the use of AI to frame that?
So I guess what I'd say is, in terms of best practices, I think, I've sort of previewed this before. I think it's visibility and having the conversation and having a group of empowered stakeholders at the company that are empowered to make decisions and to give direction to the company. And so those same stakeholders will presumably be involved in developing the policies and the procedures and working through governance. But I think even in short of that, it is there's many tendrils to this issue. And so in any organization, particularly complex organization, like, who owns this? And do we have the right owners and decision makers? And it's very tempting, I think, for organizations to sort of put this in a box. Like, this is a privacy thing. And so we're going to put this in the privacy bucket, or this is an IP thing. And so our people that worry about IP are going to do this. And I think that with AI, there's a real balance between bolting on to existing procedures in your company. Like reinventing the wheel on everything to sort of say, AI is so fundamentally different from anything we've ever dealt with before. We have to build something entirely new from a governance or procedural perspective. Like, that's not practical. But at the same time, when you over-analogize to say, okay, that's a privacy problem, then you're really only looking at it through that lens. And that's why AI is so tricky. And I think that, as a practical matter for any organization of any size, coming up with your AI brain trust, and that has to be reflective of the risks in your organization and also different knowledge sectors. Like, what do we know the fundamental risks are with AI? It's IP, it's procurement, it's if you're highly regulated, like how your existing regulators are going to view this. How are you then putting together those people who can give answers and give answers quickly? So even if these policies are in development or, you're still muddling your way through it, how is it that at least centralized at your organization, you have the right group of people that are intaking the information and then making the decision and giving the guidance in a way that's going to be respected and implemented, in accordance with your company's expectations. I don't know, Anthony, your views on that.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing answer. And the only thing I think I would add is just really push the conversation around risk more often. So I think if we're talking about somebody who is acquiring AI or subscribing to AI, what I find is that the emphasis always tends to be on the case study and the ROI and all of that. But people tend to forget about having the conversation about risk. And I think that's partially training the folks who are coming up with the case studies, moving them forward, making sure that they are aware of the key risks from a company point of view, the strategic risks, as opposed to the operational risks. And they're engaging the suppliers in those conversations because everybody's finding their way around these risks right now. And so we need to give people the benefit of the doubt, but it also means that we need to re-engage on that conversation regularly and then loop that into what Meredith said.
Wonderful. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience, so we'll kind of throw your way. So the first one is, we're using AI internally and externally. Is there insurance, that can help to protect against these gaps? And is, is it worth looking into from an organizational standpoint?
It's a great question and one that's worthy of its own hour. And I know we don't have that time, but I think the key is don't assume that you are protected and that there are a lot of companies in the insurance side that are looking about how to monetize this for themselves to insure these risks. And so I think the question is, if your company is assuming that your insurance covers this risk, doing a policy audit is critical to figure out, okay, what risks are we incurring with AI that are not covered? And then talking with your brokers and figuring out what's on the market in terms of, is there something available that covers this risk at a price point that makes sense given the risk? But it's definitely an emerging area and one where, it's really assuming that you're covered is a dangerous proposition. And it's, the insurance companies, again, this is what I love about the law, right? And about contract, is the way these policies are written, never contemplated any of this. And so a lot of these existing policies, they begin to move their coverage and their exclusions. And as you see updates, in your policies, really keeping an eye on it and saying, okay, when we think about our risk assessment and our strategic governance, having somebody that sort of says, yeah, on our risk representation on this sort of empowered decision-making is taking a look at what risk is insured and what risk isn't. And then if it's not insured, or even if it is, how am I being indemnified for this risk? Can I be indemnified for this risk? And how am I shifting this risk to the person that can best control for that risk, which may or may not be you?
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question is, given there's a very rapidly evolving sort of regulatory sort of framework and complexities that are sort of happening with what companies may have to look at sort of reporting for their use of AI, and that's across Canada, across the US, across the world. And I know this in itself is also its own webinar topic, but do you kind of have a sense of what some of these, organizations might need to be sort of thinking of for customers, if they're using AI in their products?
So I'm happy to answer that sort of just generally, knowing that we won't be able to do it as service. I think we need to think about, what are the risks? Is this fair? what are the sort of fundamental rights that we think of as humans? Like, are you using it in employment? Are you using it for housing? Are you using it in a way that's really could, you know, unfairly harm somebody? And if the answer is yes or maybe, those are the risks that you're most likely going to have to report on. And then I think the rest of it is knowing the answers to questions. Like, the good and bad news about it evolving is that when there are new regulations, it's actually a gift, because then you know what the standard is that you're meeting. And in some ways now is the most challenging time. And, you know, at least in the United States, getting a federal regulation, you know, doing anything at the federal level is very, very challenging. And we're seeing a lot of movement at the state level. But at least regulations tell you, like, this is what you have to do. But now what we're seeing is, like, what are the existing requirements you're already subject to? And how does AI layer on that? How does that fit in? And so I think asking sort of the base questions, how are we using it? Why are we using it? And how is our use defensible based on what we know can go wrong with AI? And if you have good answers to those questions, or at least asking those questions, you're going to be pretty well positioned to then respond when a regulator comes to town.
And I would say that the RACE framework is really good for this. Like they're very clear that they're not a legal compliance tool. But as Meredith says, that is maybe the easiest part of this. How you fit within the broader ethical and legal responsibilities that aren't specifically regulated, you know, within the concept of due diligence that Meredith outlined earlier, like what is your defense? I mean, that's something that I think that framework does a really good job of addressing. So I would encourage your members to start there.
Wonderful. And I think, yeah, I mean, to your point, the motto is also too that it's iterative and evolving, and that you just have to be open to, like you said, you cover off one thing, but tomorrow there could be something else, and sort of to be mindful of that. Related to that, you know, for a lot of organizations, you know, that engage with third-party AI solutions, touch upon that sort of in your talk as well. You know, are there sort of at a higher level sort of, you know, predominant risks, you know, or litigation sort of concerns a service provider might encounter, you know, and that could potentially sort of incur in this, that you might be able to flesh out a bit more?
So I guess I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Are we taking this from the perspective of the service provider? So I'm the service provider offering these solutions, or I'm consuming these solutions? Because I was...
Yeah, when engaging third-party AI solutions, what are the predominant risks and litigation concerns a service provider might encounter, and types of liabilities could we potentially incur on the service side? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think on here, it's really the risk that we've been talking about. And part of it is, you know, data leakage, data flow, and, you know, what representations you're making about what this does or doesn't do, and what commitments you're making with respect to compliance with applicable law and other things as they're evolving. And so I think trying to take your sort of ordinary compliance with applicable law, concept is challenging. What we're seeing a lot, and what we're recommending, depending on what side of the aisle we're on, is really putting in reps and warranties around AI, and putting in contractual commitments from vendors that either, you know, prevent them or require ample disclosure. And then the other part that's tricky with AI is now there's also a marketing race to call everything AI. And that adds to the confusion, because everyone wants to be AI right now, because AI is the thing. And so when we're talking about AI, is it AI? How is it AI? And then what risks are, if you're the service provider, what can you really not commit to knowing that this is evolving? And then what are your liability caps? I mean, when it comes to brass tacks, how much can your organization bear? And how much can your either as a consumer or a provider? And how are you sure that those sort of indemnities and liability caps are adequately capturing the AI landscape?
Yeah, I'd be very careful making reps around as a vendor that you have responsible AI. So what does that actually mean? You know, firstly. And then secondly, I think if you're a supplier of AI technology, you probably should get ahead of this and develop a more comprehensive framework, which then you can share with your customers. Otherwise, like we've seen in cybersecurity, the customers are going to come with their very extensive requirements that may not make sense in terms of the scale of your business. So I think getting ahead of this is very important, especially if you're a supplier of AI technology or services.
Thank you for this. And I know that we'll have a couple of sort of resource links, I think, too, that you'll be able to sort of to share with our audience as we go. And before sort of we sign off and I hand it back to Zane, if there's one key takeaway that you want to leave with the audience today as we're about to sign off, what would that be for each of you?
Well, for me, it would be just engage in the corporate governance conversation along the lines of what we discussed. That's what we're really trying to drive home.
And I guess mine would be sort of related, but the time is now. The standard is not perfection.
Wonderful. And on that note, I'd like to express thanks on behalf of our whole team here at Digital and everyone online for carving out time. I know in your very hectic schedules to, share your insights, and these practices and get people to start thinking and talking about this. So thank you very much. And with that, Zane, I hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Jen. Thank you once again for joining the webinar today, hosted by Digital and our wonderful director of IP, Jen. The recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel and our website in the coming days, and all those attending today will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with any resources discussed throughout the session. And that's it from us at Digital, and we'll see you at the next session in March. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.